Hello, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a story that begins with a 78th birthday cake for 12 and ends with a gender reveal for 200, with no seat saved for the woman who started it all. This is Narratives of Aunt Maris, where Black women's stories in America are told honestly with every handwritten invitation, ignored phone call, and late night prayer still attached. Picture this. You're in your best navy dress, lipstick on, table set with the good china you only use for special occasions. Balloons are tied to the porch. The cake is frosted with pink roses because your late husband always said they matched your cheeks when you smiled. 2 o'clock comes and goes. 3 o'clock. 4. No one knocks. No car pulls into the driveway. Then you open your phone and see it your daughter-in-law glowing in a backyard full of people. A caption that reads, 20 guests. Only close family. Nobody to bother us. On your birthday. In that moment, the hollow space in your house turns into a decision. And here's the hard reality check. If you ever find yourself in a moment like that, you might not walk away with your sanity or your heart still intact. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And while you're here, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel, from big cities to small towns, from night shift breaks to quiet bedrooms where you're finally alone with your thoughts. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a little soft background noise. And let's begin tonight's journey together. I invited the entire family to my 78th birthday. Nobody came. Then my daughter-in-law posted photos of the baby gender reveal with the caption, 20 guests, only close family. Nobody to bother us. In that moment, I decided to send them a gift. I'm so happy you're here. Stick with me until the end and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. But let me start from the beginning, because the pain of that day didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of something that had been building for years. Something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. 3 weeks before my birthday, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my address book. The same leather-bound book I'd used for decades. My handwriting had gotten shakier over the years. But I was determined to write each invitation by hand. Personal touches mattered. I believed. They showed love, intention, care. I started with Darius, my son. You are cordially invited to celebrate Mom's 78th birthday. I wrote carefully. I mentioned the date, the time, how much it would mean to me to have him there. I sealed the envelope with the same care I'd used for his childhood birthday party invitations back when he actually got excited about family celebrations. Then Tiana, my daughter-in-law, I chose my words even more carefully with her. Over the past 5 years, I'd learned to walk on eggshells around Tiana. She had a way of twisting words, of finding offense where none was intended. Dear Tiana, I wrote, I would be honored to have you join us for my birthday celebration. I added a note about how I hoped she was feeling well with the pregnancy, how excited I was about becoming a great-grandmother. My daughter Monique got the next invitation. She lived 2 states away, but had always been good about visiting for important occasions. At least she used to be. The last few birthdays had been missed due to work conflicts, her kids' activities. various emergencies that seemed to crop up whenever family gatherings were planned.
Then there were the others, my sister Denise, my nephew Andre and his family, a few close friends who'd known me for decades. By the time I finished addressing all the envelopes, my hand was cramping, but my heart felt full. A house full of people who mattered to me, sharing stories, laughing together. That's all I wanted. I drove to the post office the next day, handing each invitation to the postal clerk like I was delivering something precious, because to me, they were. Each envelope carried not just an invitation, but hope. The RSVPs started coming in slowly. Monique called first. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but Jalen has a soccer tournament that weekend. You know how these things are scheduled months in advance." I did know. I'd attended plenty of Jalen's games when he was younger. Before the two-state distance became an excuse for everything. Denise's response came via her daughter. Aunt Denise wasn't feeling well. Nothing serious, just thought it best to stay home and rest. My nephew Andre texted me. Work commitment had come up, couldn't get out of it. Maybe next time. But Darius hadn't responded. Neither had Tiana. I waited, telling myself they were just busy with the pregnancy and preparations. First babies brought so much excitement, so much planning. I remembered when I was pregnant with Darius, how Leonard and I would spend hours talking about cribs and names and what kind of parents we wanted to be. Leonard had been gone for 12 years now, but I still caught myself setting two place settings sometimes. Still heard his laugh echoing through the house during quiet moments. He would have loved being a great-grandfather. He would have made sure our son remembered what family meant. A week before the party, I called Darius directly. "Hi, sweetheart," I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice light. "I just wanted to confirm about Saturday. I know you've been busy with everything." There was a pause. I could hear Tiana talking in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Oh, Mom," Darius said finally, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "About Saturday. We might not be able to make it." "Might not," I repeated. Tiana's been having some morning sickness issues, and the doctor said she should avoid stressful situations. My birthday party was a stressful situation. I gripped the phone tighter. I understand she hasn't been feeling well, but it's just family. Darius. Just a quiet celebration. She could rest on the couch if she needed to. "Mom, you know how these things go. Family gatherings can get overwhelming, especially with her condition." Family gatherings as if my birthday party was some chaotic circus instead of what I'd planned. A simple afternoon with cake and conversation. Darius. I've sent invitations to everyone 3 weeks ago. I've been planning this, preparing everything. I know, and we appreciate that. But we have to think about the baby now. The baby. Everything had become about the baby since they had announced the pregnancy 4 months ago. Don't stress. Tiana. Don't upset Tiana. Think about the baby. As if my presence, my very existence, was somehow harmful to my future great-grandchild. Of course, I heard myself saying. The baby comes first, I understand. But I didn't understand. I didn't understand how wanting to celebrate another year of life with my family had become an imposition. I didn't understand how my son, who used to call me every Sunday without fail, now spoke to me like I was a burden he had to manage. After I hung up, I sat in Leonard's old chair and stared at the decorations I'd already started putting up. Streamers in my favorite colors. A banner that read, "Happy 78th birthday," in cheerful letters. The cake I'd ordered from the bakery downtown decorated with pink roses because Leonard always said they matched my cheeks when I smiled. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I was expecting too much. Maybe this was just what happened when families grew and changed. Maybe 78 was too old to care about birthdays anyway. But Saturday morning, I got up early and finished decorating anyway. I arranged the flowers I'd bought, set out the good china, prepared the sandwiches and appetizers I'd planned. I told myself maybe Darius would change his mind. Maybe Tiana would feel better. Maybe someone would come. I put on my best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that Leonard had complimented 20 years ago. I did my hair and put on lipstick and the earrings Darius had given me for Christmas 3 years back, when gift-giving still felt thoughtful instead of obligatory. At 2:00, the house was perfect. At 2:15, I sat on the couch and waited. At 2:30, I checked my phone for messages. Nothing. At 3:00, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the dining room table I'd set for 12 people. By 4:00, I knew nobody was coming. I should have felt sad. I should have cried. Instead, I felt something much worse. A hollow emptiness that seemed to echo through every room of the house. This was my reality. At 78 years old, after raising children and loving grandchildren and building a life centered around family, I was sitting alone on my birthday. That's when I made the mistake of checking Facebook. Tiana's post was at the top of my feed, uploaded just an hour earlier. The photos showed a beautiful backyard decorated in pink and blue tables filled with elegant appetizers. Clusters of laughing people holding champagne glasses. Tiana glowed in the center of it all, her hand resting on her growing belly, surrounded by what looked like half the town. 200 guests. Only close family. Nobody to bother us. Read the caption, followed by heart emojis and congratulations from dozens of people. I stared at those words until they blurred. Nobody to bother us on my birthday. While I sat alone in my decorated house, they were celebrating new life with 200 people who mattered more than I did. I scrolled through the comments, friends congratulating them, family members I recognized, people I'd known for years who had somehow become part of their close circle while I'd become nobody to bother with. That's when I saw him, Darius, in the background of one photo, laughing at something someone was saying. He looked happier than I'd seen him in months. Relaxed, free from the stress of having to manage his difficult mother. I set the phone down and looked around my empty house. The decorations that had seemed cheerful that morning now looked pathetic. The cake, sitting untouched on the counter, seemed like a monument to my own delusion. The carefully arranged place settings mocked me with their emptiness. But as I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of my irrelevance, something shifted inside me. The hollow emptiness began to fill with something else, something harder, something that had been building for years, but that I'd been too polite, too hopeful, too maternal to acknowledge. They didn't just forget my birthday. They actively chose to exclude me while celebrating life with 200 other people. They didn't just neglect me, they erased me. I walked to Leonard's old desk in the corner of the living room and pulled out the phone book. I found the number I was looking for and dialed carefully. Fulton and Associates. Came the professional voice on the other end. "This is Evelyn Carter," I said, my voice steadier than it had been all day. "I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Patterson. It's regarding my estate planning." "Certainly. Mrs. Carter. When would be convenient for you?" I looked around my empty house at the birthday celebration that never was, at the life I'd built that seemed to matter so little to the people I'd built it for. "Monday morning," I said. "First thing Monday morning. Because sometimes when people show you exactly who you are to them, the kindest gift you can give them in return is the truth about what that choice will cost them." Sunday morning came gray and quiet. I woke up in Leonard's old chair where I'd fallen asleep, still wearing my birthday dress. The decorations hung limply from the ceiling, and the untouched cake sat on the counter like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name yet. I made coffee with shaking hands, not from age, but from something deeper. As I sat at the kitchen table, my mind kept circling back to that Facebook post. "Nobody to bother us." The words had lodged themselves in my chest like a splinter, working deeper every time I breathed. But it wasn't just yesterday. As I stared into my coffee cup, memories began surfacing like photographs developed in a dark room, slowly revealing images I hadn't wanted to see clearly before. Last Christmas, I'd spent weeks knitting a blanket for the baby. Tiny stitches in soft yellow yarn because they hadn't revealed the gender yet. I'd wrapped it carefully and driven to Darius's house on Christmas morning, excited to be part of their holiday tradition. When I arrived, Tiana answered the door in her pajamas. "Oh, Priscilla," she'd said, not moving aside to let me in. "We're having a quiet Christmas morning, just the two of us. You know how it is with the pregnancy. I need to avoid overstimulation." Through the window behind her, I could see the living room. 2 coffee cups on the table. Presents scattered around the tree. The intimate scene of a couple enjoying their holiday alone without the overstimulating presence of his mother. "I just wanted to drop this off," I'd said, holding out the carefully wrapped blanket. "I can go right back home." Tiana had taken the gift with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's so thoughtful. Well, open it later when we're doing family gifts." Family gifts. I wasn't family. Apparently, I was something separate. Something that required management and scheduling. I'd driven home that Christmas morning and spent the day watching old movies, telling myself it was natural for young couples to want privacy during the holidays. New traditions, I'd reasoned. That's how families evolved. But there was more. Easter, when they'd had a dinner party for 12 people. And I'd found out about it through Monique, who mentioned it casually during a phone call. It sounded lovely, she'd said. Tiana posted all those photos of the beautiful table setting. I'd gone to Facebook that night and scrolled through the images. My son carving ham at the head of a table I'd never seen, surrounded by Tiana's college friends, her book club, people from their neighborhood, all these relationships that had somehow become more important than the woman who'd raised him. The 4th of July barbecue I'd heard about secondhand from my neighbor, who mentioned seeing Darius at the hardware store buying supplies for their party. When I'd called to ask about it, he'd said it was just a small thing, very last minute. You know how it is. But I'd driven by that evening, unable to help myself. Their backyard had been full of people, string lights twinkling between the trees, laughter carrying over the fence. I'd sat in my car at the end of the street, watching my son
flip burgers for what looked like half the neighborhood while I ate a microwave dinner alone. Each memory brought another, like pulling a thread that unraveled an entire tapestry I'd woven in my mind about what my relationship with my son actually was. The time Tiana had mentioned needing help with wedding planning for her cousin, and I'd offered to assist. "Oh, that's sweet," she'd said. "But we've already got it handled. These young people today, they have such specific ideas about how they want things done." The time Darius had casually mentioned they were looking at new cars, and I'd suggested we could go shopping together. Maybe make a day of it like we used to when he was younger. "Thanks, Mom. But Tiana's got it all researched online. We're probably just going to go straight to the dealer." The time I'd offered to help paint the nursery. Excited to be part of preparing for my first great-grandchild. "We've actually hired someone," Tiana had said. "Professional painters. You know, we want it done right." Each offer to help, each attempt to be included had been politely deflected, always with an excuse that sounded reasonable on the surface, but carried the same underlying message. "We don't need you. We don't want you. You're not part of this." I'd blame myself mostly. I was getting older, maybe more difficult without realizing it. Maybe I was too set in my ways, too eager to be involved. Maybe I needed to give them space to build their own lives. But yesterday had stripped away all those gentle excuses. Yesterday had shown me the truth in stark, unavoidable terms. While I sat alone on my birthday, they were celebrating with 200 people. While I was deemed nobody to bother with, they were surrounded by friends, family, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone except me. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Darius's name appeared on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone he'd developed over the past few years, the tone he used when he had to manage me. "How was your birthday? How was my birthday?" I stared at the decorations still hanging from my ceiling. "It was quiet," I said. "That's probably good. You deserve to relax on your special day." Relax, as if choosing to spend my birthday alone had been a preference rather than an abandonment. "Darius," I said slowly, "did you see Tiana's Facebook post yesterday? There was a pause, a long one." "What post?" He knew exactly what post. I could hear it in the careful blankness of his voice. The gender reveal party. Another pause. "Oh, that. Yeah. It was just a small thing that got out of hand. You know how Tiana is with party planning. Small thing, 200 people. It looked lovely." I said. "Yeah, it was nice. Tiana was happy. The baby's healthy, which is what matters most. The baby again. Everything always came back to the baby. As if my desire to be included in my family's life was somehow a threat to an unborn child." "Darius," I said, and I could hear something new in my own voice, something that had crystallized overnight. "We need to talk." "Sure. Mom, what about not over the phone?" "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about where things stand." Where things stand. He sounded genuinely confused, as if the systematic exclusion of his mother from his life was so natural he hadn't even noticed it happening. "I'll call you later in the week to arrange something," I said after I've had time to think. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound different." "Different? Yes. I did sound different because something fundamental had shifted in the space between my empty birthday party and this phone call. The woman who had spent years making excuses for her family's neglect was gone. In her place was someone who had finally seen the pattern clearly. I'm fine. Darius, I'll talk to you soon. After I hung up, I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. Photos of Darius covered every surface, his school pictures, graduation photos, wedding pictures with Tiana, photos of him as a child when his face would light up every time I walked into a room, when I was the most important person in his world and he was the center of mine. But there were no recent photos of us together. I couldn't remember the last time someone had taken a picture of Darius and me at his wedding. Maybe 3 years ago, when I'd still believed I was an important part of his life. I picked up one photo from his college graduation. I was standing beside him, my arm around his shoulders, both of us beaming at the camera. I remembered that day so clearly, how proud I'd been, how excited for his future, how certain I'd been that no matter what life brought, we'd always have each other. That woman in the photo looked so hopeful, so naive. She had no idea that her son was already beginning to see her as an obligation rather than a blessing. She couldn't have imagined that the daughter-in-law she'd welcomed with open arms would systematically work to erase her from their lives. I set the photo down and walked to Leonard's desk. The appointment with Mr. Fulton wasn't until Monday morning, but I could start preparing now. I pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, not about money or possessions, and those were just details, but about what I'd finally understood. My family had made their choice. They'd chosen their comfort over my inclusion. They'd chosen their new relationships over our history. They'd chosen to see me as a burden rather than a blessing. Now it was time for me to make my choice, and for the first time in years, I was going to choose myself. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that used to fill me with energy. Today, it felt like a beginning. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one Leonard had always said made me look formidable. I was going to need to be formidable today. Mr. Fulton's office hadn't changed much in the 15 years since Leonard and I had first established our wills. Same mahogany furniture, same law books lining the walls, same smell of leather and old paper that suggested serious business was conducted here. Mrs. Carter, Caleb Fulton said, rising from behind his desk. He was older now, grayer. But his handshake was still firm and his eyes still sharp. It's good to see you, Sodo. I was surprised by your call. Is everything all right? I settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. I need to make some changes to my will. Caleb, significant changes. He pulled out a thick file folder with my name on it, of course. What kind of changes are we talking about? I'd rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless hours of Sunday night. But sitting here now, the words felt heavier than I'd expected. I want to remove Darius and Tiana as beneficiaries. Caleb Penn stopped moving across his notepad. He looked up at me over his reading glasses. The same look he'd given me 15 years ago when I'd insisted on leaving everything to family, despite his gentle suggestions about charitable giving. That's a substantial change. Priscilla, may I ask what's prompted this decision? I told him about the birthday party, about the years of exclusion disguised as concern for Tiana's well-being, about the Facebook post that had finally shown me how little I mattered to the people I'd spent my life loving. Caleb listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished,
He was quiet for a long moment. "I understand you're hurt," he said finally. "Family dynamics can be complicated, especially when new marriages and pregnancies change the established relationships. But these kinds of decisions made in the heat of emotion, this isn't emotion, Caleb," I interrupted. "This is clarity. For the first time in years, I'm seeing my family situation clearly." He studied me for another moment, then opened my file. "Let's talk about what you want to do instead. Have you thought about alternative beneficiaries?" I had thought about it all Sunday night.
In fact, I want to establish a trust fund for the baby. The child should have financial security for education, but the parents shouldn't be able to access it until the child turns 25. That's certainly possible. What about the rest of your estate? I need time to research some options. Charities, maybe organizations that actually help people instead of excluding them. Caleb nodded, making more notes. "We can draft a preliminary document with the trust for your great-grandchild and leave the remainder in a temporary holding pattern until you decide on final beneficiaries. That gives you time to be certain about these changes." As we worked through the details, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Control. For so long, I'd let other people's comfort determine my choices. Now, I was making decisions based on my own values, my own sense of what was right. "There's one more thing," I said as we wrapped up. "I want this kept completely confidential until after the baby is born. I don't want this to be seen as manipulating their pregnancy experience." Of course, client confidentiality is absolute. I left the law office feeling lighter than I had in months, but also strangely empty. Like I'd just amputated a limb that had been causing me pain for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be whole. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friend Yvonne, who'd moved to Florida after her husband died. We'd fallen out of touch when I'd become so focused on trying to maintain my relationship with Darius and Tiana. "Priscilla." Yvonne's voice was warm with surprise. What a wonderful surprise. "How are you, honey?" We talked for 2 hours about her grandchildren who visited every month, about the book club she joined, about the volunteer work she was doing at a local hospital. Her life sounded full, meaningful, connected to people who valued her presence. "What about you?" she asked. "How are Darius and that wife of his? When's the baby due?" I found myself telling her the truth. Not the sanitized version I usually gave people, but the real story of isolation and exclusion. Yvonne listened with the kind of attention I'd forgotten people could give. "Oh, sweetheart," she said when I finished. "I'm so sorry, but you know what's sometimes families need to earn their place in our lives, blood relation or not." After we hung up, I realized how long it had been since anyone had asked about my well-being without immediately redirecting the conversation to more important topics like Tiana's morning sickness or Darius's work stress. That evening, I decided to do more research. If I was going to see my situation clearly, I needed all the information available. I opened my laptop and went to Facebook, something I rarely did anymore except to see photos of my family's life that I wasn't part of. But tonight, I wasn't looking for current posts. I was looking for patterns. I scrolled back through months of Tiana's posts.
birthday parties for her friends, dinner parties at their house, holiday celebrations, beach trips, weekend getaways, a steady stream of social activities, all photographed and shared with careful captions about wonderful friends and chosen family and perfect evenings. I wasn't in any of them, not one. I found photos from Darius's last birthday party 8 months ago, a surprise party Tiana had organized at their house. 30 people according to the comments, colleagues from his work, friends from college, neighbors, Tiana's book club, a beautifully decorated backyard, a custom cake, Darius looking genuinely delighted by the celebration. I hadn't even known about it until I'd called him the next day to wish him happy birthday. And he'd mentioned that Tiana had thrown him a little party with a few friends. I kept scrolling. Mother's Day from 2 years ago. Tiana had posted a photo of flowers and a card with the caption from my wonderful husband celebrating me as the mother of his future children. Below it, dozens of comments from friends congratulating her, talking about what a thoughtful husband Darius was. No mention of his actual mother, no photo of flowers from him to me. In fact, I couldn't remember receiving flowers from Darius for Mother's Day in years. When had that stopped? When had I stopped being worthy of acknowledgement as a mother on the day specifically designed to honor mothers? I found the photos from their last anniversary dinner. A fancy restaurant, wine, romantic lighting. 2 years of perfect marriage with my soulmate, the caption read. The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations on their happiness. I remembered that night I'd called Darius that morning to wish them a happy anniversary, and he'd mentioned they were going out to dinner. I'd offered to babysit if they ever needed it for future date nights. And then he'd said, "Thanks, Mom. We'll keep that in mind," in the tone people use when they're acknowledging an offer they'll never accept. But it was the Christmas photos that really drove the point home. Last Christmas. The one where Tiana had been too overstimulated to let me inside on Christmas morning had actually been followed by a large gathering that same evening. 15 people around their dinner table. Everyone dressed up, multiple courses, wine glasses, the works. The caption read, "Christmas dinner with our chosen family. Grateful for the people who make life beautiful." Chosen family. People who make life beautiful, while his actual mother had spent Christmas alone, eating a frozen dinner and watching old movies. I closed the laptop and sat back in Leonard's chair, finally understanding something that had been nagging at me for months. This wasn't about Tiana's pregnancy sensitivities or their need for space as a young couple. This was about a deliberate construction of a life that didn't include me. They hadn't gradually drifted away from me. They had actively built a social world where I didn't exist, then convinced themselves that my absence was natural, even necessary. They had rewritten the story of our family to cast me as the outsider, the burden, the person who needed to be managed rather than included. The next morning, I called Monique. My daughter had been distant lately, but I'd assumed it was just the usual struggles of raising teenagers 2 states away. Oh, I wondered if there was more to it, Mom, she said when she answered. And I caught the slightly weary tone that had become familiar in my children's voices. "How are you?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I was wondering if you could tell me something honestly. Have Darius or Tiana said anything to you about me? About my behavior or problems they've been having with me?" There was a long pause. Too long. Mom, why would you ask that? Because I'm starting to realize there are conversations happening about me that I'm not part of, and I need to know what's being said. Another pause. Then in a rush, Tiana mentioned that you've been calling a lot lately, that you seem lonely and maybe a little too dependent on them for social interaction. She's worried about you, but also worried about setting healthy boundaries with the baby coming. My chest tightened. When did she tell you this? A few months ago. She said they were trying to help you develop other friendships, other interests. That's why they were encouraging you to join that senior center. Remember? I remembered. Tiana had mentioned the senior center several times, always framing it as concern for my social well-being. But now I understood what it really was. It was a way to redirect my attention away from them, to make my loneliness someone else's problem. Monique. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I call Darius because he's my son and I love him, not because I'm pathologically dependent? Mom. She sounded uncomfortable now. I think everyone just wants what's best for you. Everyone. My own daughter had been discussing my mental state and social needs with my daughter-in-law, and they'd all agreed that the problem was me. Too needy, too lonely, too much. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. The picture was becoming devastatingly clear. Tiana hadn't just excluded me from their social life. She'd created a narrative about me that justified that exclusion. And worse, she'd convinced my own children that this narrative was true. I wasn't just losing my place in my family, I was being erased from it. One conversation at a time. And the people I loved most in the world were helping it happen. The revelation about Monique's conversation with Tiana left me sleepless for 3 nights. I kept replaying her words. Tiana mentioned that you've been calling a lot lately, as if my weekly calls to my own son were evidence of some psychological deficiency rather than normal maternal affection. By Thursday, I'd made a decision. I needed to know exactly how deep this narrative went and who else had been convinced that I was the problem in this family dynamic. I started with my sister Denise. We'd always been close, though we'd seen less of each other since Leonard died. I called her under the pretense of checking on her health after she'd missed my birthday. "Oh, Priscilla," she said, her voice carrying that careful tone I was starting to recognize. "I'm feeling much better." Darius called to check on me. Actually, such a thoughtful boy. Darius had called her. My son had called my sister to check on her health, but hadn't bothered to show up for my birthday. "That was nice of him," I said carefully. "He mentioned he was worried about you, though," said. "You seem to be having a hard time adjusting to their new life stage." He asked if I thought you might benefit from some professional help, maybe counseling to deal with the transition to becoming a great-grandmother. My hands tightened on the phone. Professional help? Darius was discussing my mental health with my sister, suggesting I needed therapy because I wanted to be part of my family's life. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Well, I said transitions can be difficult for everyone, but that you've always been resilient, though I did mention that you've seemed a bit more focused on them lately, maybe a little too invested in their decisions, too invested in my own son's life, in my first great-grandchild, the people I'd dedicated my entire adult life to loving and supporting." After I hung up, I called my nephew, Andre. Same story, different details. Tiana had reached out to him months ago, expressing concern about my emotional well-being and asking if family members had noticed any changes in my behavior. She'd painted herself as the caring daughter-in-law trying to help her husband manage his increasingly needy mother. The picture was becoming crystal clear now. This wasn't accidental exclusion or natural family evolution. This was a calculated campaign to reframe me as the problem while positioning Tiana as the solution. She'd systematically contacted my family members, planting seeds of concern about my mental state and dependency. She'd created a narrative where my desire for inclusion became evidence of instability, and my normal expressions of love became symptoms of unhealthy attachment. And it had worked. My own family now saw me through the lens Tiana had created for them. Every phone call, every invitation, every attempt to be part of their lives was interpreted as further proof that I was too needy, too dependent, too much to handle during this delicate time. That Friday afternoon, I drove to the library and spent 3 hours researching something I'd never thought I'd need to understand: emotional manipulation and family alienation. The books described patterns I recognized immediately: the gradual isolation, the reframing of normal behavior as problematic, the recruitment of others to validate the new narrative. It was textbook psychological manipulation. And I'd been living in the middle of it for 2 years without recognizing what was happening. But now I knew, and now I could plan accordingly. I called Mr. Fulton and scheduled another appointment. This time I had specific instructions about how I wanted my estate structured. I want the trust for my great-grandchild to be substantial. I told him when we met the following Monday, enough to ensure a complete college education and a solid start in adult life. But I want specific conditions attached. Caleb took notes as I outlined my requirements. The child would receive the first distribution at age 18 for college expenses, but only if they personally contacted me or my designated representative to request the funds. No parental intermediaries allowed. The second distribution would come at age 25. Again, requiring direct contact and a personal meeting if I was still alive. I want the child to know that this money came from their great-grand and mother, who loved them before they were born, I explained. But I also want them to understand why their parents couldn't access these funds. What about the rest of your estate? Caleb asked. I'd spent the weekend researching charitable organizations, particularly those focused on elderly care and family support services. I want to establish a foundation, I said, something that helps elderly people who've been isolated or abandoned by their families. There are more of us than people realize. Caleb nodded approvingly. That's a meaningful legacy. Priscilla, though I have to ask, are you certain about excluding Darius entirely? Sometimes family relationships can be repaired. I thought about that question for a long time. Caleb, if Darius ever comes to understand what he's allowed to happen and genuinely wants to rebuild our relationship, he won't need my money to do it. And if he doesn't understand, then he doesn't deserve to benefit from the life I built while he was systematically excluding me from his over the next few weeks. I began making other changes, too. I stopped calling Darius weekly, curious to see if he would notice or reach out on his own. He didn't. I stopped sending Tiana the pregnancy articles I'd been clipping from magazines, the little gifts I'd been dropping off when I went shopping and saw something for the baby. I pulled back completely from their lives and waited to see if they would notice the absence of the woman they'd painted as too needy and too present. They didn't notice. If anything, my absence seemed to relieve them. No more obligation to manage my feelings or work around my supposed emotional instability. But I wasn't just pulling back, I was also building something new. I reconnected with Yvonne and several other old friends I'd neglected during my years of focusing primarily on family. I joined a book club at the library. I started volunteering at a local nursing home, reading to residents who reminded me of myself, people with stories to tell and love to give. But no one left who wanted to listen. The volunteer work was particularly eye-opening. I met dozens of women like me, mothers and grandmothers who'd been shuffled aside by busy adult children who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. Their stories varied in details, but followed the same pattern: gradual exclusion disguised as concern for their well-being. Family narratives that painted them as too demanding or too fragile. Adult children who had convinced themselves that neglect was actually kindness. The hardest part, said Laverne, a 75-year-old former teacher whose daughter lived 10 minutes away but visited twice a year, is that they really believe they're doing the right thing. They've convinced themselves that we're better off being handled rather than included. That phrase stuck with me. Handled rather than included. That's exactly what had been happening to me for the past 2 years. 6 weeks after my birthday, Tiana posted an announcement on Facebook. They'd chosen a name for the baby. Emma Rose, if it was a girl. Caleb Leonard, if it was a boy. The middle name caught my attention immediately. Leonard. My late husband's name. My son was planning to name his child after his father. But I learned about it from a Facebook post, not from a phone call or a personal conversation. Even something as significant as naming their child after his father wasn't worthy of direct communication with me. I stared at that post for a long time, remembering how excited Leonard had been when Darius was born. How he'd held that tiny baby and talked about all the things he wanted to teach him, all the adventures they'd have together. Leonard had died when Darius was 25, but they'd had a beautiful relationship built on genuine affection and respect. Now Darius was potentially naming his son after a man who had modeled loving, inclusive family relationships while simultaneously excluding that man's widow from any meaningful role in the child's life. The irony was devastating. That night, I called Mr. Fulton one more time. I want to add something to the trust conditions. I told him. What kind of addition if they named the baby after my late husband? I want a letter included with the trust documents. A letter from Leonard's perspective explaining what family meant to him and what he would think about his son's choices. Priscilla, are you sure you want to include something that personal and potentially confrontational? I thought about Leonard's values, about the way he treated his own elderly mother with such patience and inclusion right up until she died, about how he'd always made sure I felt valued and heard, even when we disagreed. It's not confrontational, Caleb. It's educational. That baby deserves to know what kind of man he's named after. And my son needs to understand how far he strayed from his father's example. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not happiness. The situation was too sad for happiness, but a deep, settled peace that comes from finally taking action aligned with your values instead of constantly adjusting your values to accommodate other people's comfort. I was no longer trying to earn my place in a family that had already decided I didn't deserve one. Instead, I was creating a legacy that reflected my true worth, even if my family couldn't see it. And in a few months, when that baby was born, they were going to receive a gift that would change everything. a gift that would show them exactly what their choices had cost them and exactly what they'd thrown away when they decided I was nobody worth bothering with. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was having breakfast with Yvonne, who'd driven up from Florida for a week-long visit. We'd spent the previous evening laughing until our sides hurt, sharing stories about our volunteer work and the new friendships we'd both built. I felt more like myself than I had in years. My phone rang just as Yvonne was telling me about her grandson's upcoming wedding, which she was helping to plan because they actually want my input. Imagine that. Mom, Darius' voice was tight with excitement and exhaustion. The baby's here. Emma rose. She's perfect. Emma rose. A girl named after no one I knew. With my husband's name relegated to what would have been a boy, I felt a pang of something. Not quite sadness, but a recognition of another small exclusion in the grand pattern of my eraser. Congratulations, I said. And I meant it. Despite everything, a new life was always worth celebrating. How is Tiana? She's tired, but doing great. The delivery was longer than expected, but everything went perfectly. Emma's 7 2 Oz, and she has Tiana's nose and my eyes. Yvonne watched my face carefully as I took in this information. She knew the whole story by now. Had listened to months of updates about my family's systematic exclusion of me from their lives. I'm so happy for you both. I said she sounds beautiful. Mom, I know things have been complicated lately, but Tiana and I would love for you to meet Emma. Maybe this weekend. This weekend. After months of being too much trouble to include in their lives, I was suddenly being granted permission to meet my great-granddaughter. The timing wasn't coincidental. They were probably exhausted, overwhelmed with a newborn, and suddenly remembering that grandparents could be useful for support during this transition. I'd like that very much, I said. Just let me know what time works best for Tiana. After I hung up, Yvonne reached across the table and squeezed my hand. How are you feeling about this? I considered the question carefully. Happy about the baby, sad about everything else, and ready to give them the gift I've been preparing. That afternoon, I drove to the bank and retrieved the documents from my safety deposit box. Mr. Fulton had done beautiful work. The trust papers were bound in elegant folders with separate envelopes containing the letters I'd written for different scenarios. One for if they named the baby Caleb Leonard, which would have included Leonard's perspectives on family values. One for if they chose other names, which focused on my hopes for Emma's future and my sadness about the circumstances that had led to this arrangement. I also had a third envelope, one Mr. Fulton didn't know about. Inside was a letter I'd written to Darius and Tiana explaining exactly how their behavior had appeared from my perspective and what it had cost them. Not angry or accusatory, just factual. Sometimes the truth needed to be spoken clearly, even when it was uncomfortable. Saturday morning, I dressed carefully in a soft blue dress that Leonard had always said brought out my eyes. I wanted to look like the loving great-grandmother I was, not the burdensome old woman they'd convinced themselves I'd become. I tucked the trust documents into my purse along with a small gift I'd crocheted for Emma. A tiny white blanket with her initials embroidered in pale yellow thread. Darius and Tiana's house looked the same as always, but felt different as I approached the front door. This was probably the last time I'd stand on this threshold as a family member. After today, I'd be something else entirely, a consequence they'd have to live with. Tiana answered the door, looking exhausted, but radiant in the way new mothers do. She was holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink, and despite everything that had happened between us, my heart melted at the sight. "Priscilla," she said, her voice softer than it had been in months. "Come in." She's been sleeping for the past hour, but she should wake up soon. The living room was scattered with baby gear, bouncy seats, blankets, flowers from well-wishers. I counted at least a dozen flower arrangements, evidence of all the people who'd reached out to celebrate Emma's arrival. I wondered if any of them were from people who'd attended my empty birthday party. Darius appeared from the kitchen carrying coffee. He looked older, more serious, like becoming a father had added weight to his shoulders. "Mom, thanks for coming. We really wanted you to meet her." We sat down together on the couch, and Tiana carefully transferred Emma into my arms. She was perfect. Tiny features, wisps of dark hair, that newborn sweetness that makes your chest tight with love. I felt tears prick my eyes as I held her, thinking about all the moments like this I'd imagined sharing with my family. "She's absolutely beautiful," I whispered, running my finger along her soft cheek. "You must be so proud." "We are," Dario said. "It's been incredible, but also overwhelming. We had no idea how much work it would be." "The first few weeks are the hardest," I said, remembering his own infancy after Leonard and I had brought him home from the hospital. "But you'll find your rhythm." We talked for about an hour, the conversation surprisingly easy. Tiana seemed genuinely grateful for my presence, asking questions about Darius's early months, accepting advice about feeding schedules and sleep patterns. For a moment, I let myself imagine that maybe things could change now. Maybe becoming parents would help them understand the depth of a parent's love and the pain of exclusion. But then Tiana's phone rang, and I heard her talking to someone about having all the grandparents over next week for a big family dinner. All the grandparents. Tiana's parents, who lived across town and had apparently been regular fixtures throughout the pregnancy and delivery. I was a singular grandmother being managed separately from the family activities that mattered. "I should probably go," I said after she hung up. "I don't want to overstay my welcome, and you both need rest. Actually, Mom," Darius said, "there's something we wanted to talk to you about. Tiana's parents are going to be helping out a lot over the next few months. And we were thinking maybe you could coordinate with them, so there's not too much overlap. Too many people who loved this baby trying to be part of her life at the same time. I needed to be scheduled, managed, coordinated so I wouldn't interfere with the grandparents who actually mattered." "Of course," I said calmly. "I understand completely." I handed Emma back to Tiana and reached into my purse. "Before I go, I have something for you. For Emma. Actually, I pulled out the small crocheted blanket first. This is just something little I made for her." Tiana accepted it with appropriate appreciation, though I could see her mentally categorizing it as the kind of homemade gift that would get tucked away in a closet. Then I pulled out the trust documents. And this is something more substantial. Darius looked puzzled as I handed him the elegant folder. "What is it, a trust fund for Emma's education and future?" "It's quite substantial, enough to pay for any college she wants to attend and give her a solid financial start in adult life." Both of their faces lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Mom, That's incredibly generous, Darius said. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. I said simply, every child deserves security and opportunities. Tiana was already opening the folder, scanning the first page of legal documents. Her expression shifted as she read. Confusion replacing excitement. I don't understand some of this language. What does this part mean about direct beneficiary contact? It means Emma will need to contact the trust administrators directly when she's ready to access the funds, first at 18 for educational expenses, then at 25 for the remainder. But we're her parents, Darius said, looking up from the documents. Wouldn't we handle that kind of thing for her? Not according to the trust terms. This is Emma's money, not yours. She'll be the only one authorized to access it. I could see them processing this information, trying to understand why I'd structured it this way. Tiana flipped to the second page, then the third, her frown deepening. There's also a letter in there, I added, for Emma to read when she's old enough to understand. It explains where the money came from and why I set up the trust the way I did. What kind of letter, Darius asked, his voice taking on that careful tone I'd learned to recognize. A letter from her great-grand-mother who loved her before she was born, but won't be part of her life because her parents found me too inconvenient to include in their family. The silence that followed was thick with shock and dawning understanding. Tiana's face had gone pale, and Darius looked like I'd slapped him. Mom, what are you talking about? Darius finally managed. I stood up, smoothing down my dress, feeling calmer than I had in months. I'm talking about being excluded from your lives for the past 2 years. I'm talking about missing every celebration, every milestone, every opportunity to be part of your family because I was deemed too needy, too demanding, too much trouble to accommodate. That's not... We never said you were too much trouble, Darius stammered. You didn't have to say it. You just lived it. 200 people at your gender reveal party while I sat alone on my 78th birthday. Family dinners I learned about through Facebook. Holidays I spent alone while you celebrated with people who mattered more than I did. Tiana had been reading more of the trust documents and her face was getting paler by the minute. There's more money here than I expected, she said quietly. Much more. That trust represents about 40% of my total estate. The rest is going to charities that help elderly people who've been abandoned by their families. It turns out there are quite a few of us. Darius stood up abruptly. Mom, if you're upset about feeling left out, we can talk about that. We can fix this. But changing your will, setting up trusts behind our backs. I'm not changing my will behind your backs, I said calmly. I'm changing it in front of your faces right now. This is me telling you exactly what your choices have cost you. The room fell silent except for Emma's soft breathing. She slept peacefully through this conversation that was reshaping her entire future. Unaware that her great-grandmother was ensuring she'd have opportunities her parents would never be able to provide. This is emotional blackmail, Tiana said finally, her voice tight with anger. I looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. No. Tiana, emotional blackmail is what you've been doing to me for 2 years. Convincing my family that I'm mentally unstable because I want to be included in my son's life. Painting me as needy and demanding when all I've ever done is love you both unconditionally. This isn't blackmail. This is consequences. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. Darius followed me, his face stricken. Mom, please don't leave like this. We can work this out. I turned back to look at him one last time. This son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had somehow learned to see my love as a burden instead of a gift. Darius, you're going to be an excellent father, but you've forgotten how to be a good son. Maybe someday Emma will teach you the difference. I walked out of their house and drove home through streets that seemed brighter somehow, like someone had turned up the contrast on the whole world. Behind me, I'd left a family grappling with the reality that actions have consequences, and that the elderly woman they'd dismissed as inconsequential had just ensured their daughter's future while making their own significantly more complicated. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like myself again.
6 months later, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when Yvonne called from Florida. She'd become my closest confidant through this entire transformation, and our weekly calls had become the highlight of my week. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. I considered the question while watching a pair of cardinals build their nest in Leonard's favorite oak tree. "I'm more at peace than I've been in years," I said, and realized I truly meant it. The months following Emma's birth had been difficult in ways I'd expected, and liberating in ways I hadn't. Darius had called 17 times in the first week after I delivered the trust documents. His messages had evolved from angry to pleading to confused to hurt, cycling through every emotion except understanding. Tiana had tried a different approach. She'd shown up at my door 3 weeks later with Emma in her carrier, clearly hoping that seeing the baby would soften my resolve. We'd sat in my living room for an hour, Emma sleeping peacefully between us, while Tiana explained how much they appreciated my generosity, but wished I'd consulted them about the trust structure. "It feels like you don't trust us to make good decisions for our daughter," she'd said, her voice carrying that practiced tone of reasonable concern I'd learned to recognize. "Tiana," I'd replied calmly, "for 2 years. You've systematically excluded me from every important moment in your lives. You've convinced my family that I'm mentally unstable for wanting to be part of my son's life. You've treated my love as an inconvenience and my presence as a burden. Now you want me to trust you with decisions about my money." She'd left 20 minutes later, and I hadn't seen them since. Monique had called too, her voice tight with confusion and something that might have been accusation. "Mom, Darius told me what you did with your will. He's devastated. He says you're punishing them for normal boundary setting." "Normal boundary setting," I'd repeated. "Is that what he calls it when a mother isn't invited to her son's celebrations? But 200 other people are." The conversation had been painful, but clarifying. Monique still couldn't see past the narrative Tiana had created about my emotional instability in her mind. I was an elderly woman having an overreaction to reasonable family dynamics. She couldn't understand that what looked like boundary setting from the inside looked like systematic exclusion from the outside. But not everyone had bought into Tiana's version of events. My nephew Andre had called a month after Emma's birth, his voice careful but kind. "Aunt Priscilla, I've been thinking about our conversation a few months back about Darius asking if I thought you needed professional help. I realize now how that must have sounded to you." It sounded like my family was discussing my mental health behind my back instead of including me in their lives. I'd said, "Yeah, I can see that now, and I want you to know I never really believed there was anything wrong with you. You've always seemed pretty sharp to me."
I think maybe some people just got caught up in, I don't know, protecting Tiana or something. That conversation had meant more to me than Andre probably realized. It was the first acknowledgement from anyone in my family that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been the problem after all. The volunteer work at the nursing home had become my anchor during those difficult months. Every week, I met with residents who'd been shuffled aside by busy adult children, and I heard my own story reflected in dozens of variations. But I also met their families sometimes, and I began to understand something important. Most of the adult children weren't malicious. They were overwhelmed, focused on their own immediate families, caught up in the daily pressures of careers and mortgages and raising children. They'd convinced themselves that their parents were better off being cared for rather than included, that professional care was more important than emotional connection. They weren't evil. They were just wrong. And sometimes, like with Darius and Tiana, they'd built entire narratives to justify choices that were more about their convenience than their parents' well-being. Understanding this had helped ease some of the anger I'd carried. I was still sad about losing my place in my family, but I was no longer consumed by rage about their choices. They'd made decisions that felt right to them at the time. Now they'd have to live with the consequences. "Have you heard anything about how they're doing?" Yvonne asked, pulling me back to the present conversation. "A little," I said. Denise mentioned that Darius is struggling with the reality of new parenthood. Apparently, Tiana's parents have been less helpful than expected, too busy with their own lives to provide the constant support Darius thought they'd offer. I'd heard through family channels that Tiana's mother had gone back to work full-time after a brief maternity leave visit, and her father was dealing with his own health issues. The grandparents, who were supposed to be so much more present than me, had turned out to have their own limitations and priorities, and Tiana's been asking other family members if they think you might be willing to reconcile. I continued, but only on their terms. Of course. She wants me to acknowledge that I overreacted and apologize for setting up Emma's trust without consulting them. "Are you tempted?" Yvonne asked. "Yvonne, I thought about Emma. About the granddaughter I'd held once and might never hold again." The loss of that relationship was the hardest part of all this. But I also thought about the woman I'd become over the past months. Stronger, clearer about my own worth, surrounded by people who valued my presence instead of merely tolerating it. "No," I said finally. "I miss Emma terribly. But I won't go back to being treated like a burden who should be grateful for scraps of attention." If they ever genuinely understand what they did wrong and want to build a real relationship based on mutual respect, I'm open to that conversation. But I won't apologize for refusing to accept crumbs when I deserved a place at the table. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of the evening Leonard had died in our bedroom upstairs. He'd been unconscious by then, but I'd held his hand and told him about my day, about Darius' visit earlier that week, about the roses blooming in our garden. "I think you'd be proud of me," I whispered to him sometimes during these quiet evening moments. "I finally learned to value myself the way you always did." My new life had unexpected richness. The book club at the library had introduced me to novels I never would have chosen on my own. The nursing home visits had connected me with fascinating people. A former opera singer who regaled us with stories from her touring days. A retired professor who was writing a memoir about teaching during the civil rights era. A grandmother who was crocheting blankets for every great-grandchild she'd never been allowed to meet. I'd also reconnected with college friends I hadn't spoken to in decades. Technology, which had once seemed intimidating,
had become a bridge to relationships that had been dormant for years. My social calendar was fuller now than it had been when I was desperately trying to maintain my place in Dario's life. You know what's funny, I told Yvonne.
I spent 2 years feeling lonely and excluded, thinking something was wrong with me because my family didn't seem to want me around. Now I realize I wasn't lonely because I was deficient. I was lonely because I was surrounding myself with people who didn't value me. And now I'm surrounded by people who actually want to spend time with me. Not because they need something from me. Not because they're obligated to include me, but because they enjoy my company. It's revolutionary. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Mr. Fulton's office. Emma had reached 6 months old, which triggered a provision in the trust that required an annual update to the beneficiary file. This included a current photo and a brief report on her development. Information that would be archived for Emma to review someday when she was old enough to understand her inheritance. The trust administrators will need to collect this information directly from the parents, Mr. Fulton's assistant explained. Fulton's. They'll need to arrange a meeting to complete the documentation. I smiled, thinking about Darius and Tiana having to sit across from legal professionals and explain why the trust beneficiary's great-grandmother wasn't part of the family meetings. They'd have to confront, at least annually, the reality that their choices had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate comfort. That evening, I was writing in the journal I'd started keeping when Laverne from the nursing home called. She was the 75-year-old former teacher whose daughter visited twice a year despite living 10 minutes away. "Priscilla," she said, her voice excited. "You'll never guess what happened. My granddaughter called me today. She's 18 now, starting college next month, and she wanted to have lunch with me to talk about family history for a project she's doing. That's wonderful. Laverne." But here's the thing. During our conversation, she asked me why she sees me so rarely. She said she'd always wondered, but never asked. I told her the truth about her mother's claims that I was too frail for regular visits, too set in my ways to understand modern parenting, too much work to include in family activities. I held my breath, hoping this story had a happier ending than most of the ones I'd heard at the nursing home. And you know what she said? She said that sounded like complete nonsense to her. She asked if she could start visiting me regularly, maybe every couple of weeks. She wants to learn how to cook some of the recipes her mother never learned. Wants to hear stories about her grandfather before he died. Laverne. That's incredible. She also said something that reminded me of your situation. She said, "Sometimes parents get so focused on protecting their children that they forget their children might actually want relationships with their grandparents, that maybe her mother's protection had deprived her of something valuable." After we hung up, I thought about Emma, now 6 months old, growing up in a house where her great-grandmother was spoken of as someone who'd been unreasonable and difficult. But someday, when Emma read the letter I'd left for her in the trust documents, she'd get to hear my version of events, too. She'd understand that she'd had a great-grandmother who loved her enough to ensure her future, even when her parents couldn't see past their own comfort. Maybe she'd want to know more about the woman who'd provided for her education. Maybe she'd be curious about the great-grandfather she was indirectly named after, and the love story that had shaped the family she'd been born into. Maybe she'd wonder why her parents had found it so difficult to maintain a relationship with someone who'd only wanted to love them. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd side with her parents' version of events and see me as the difficult old woman who'd caused unnecessary drama during her early months of life. Either way, she'd have choices. Financial security, educational opportunities, and access to information that would let her make her own decisions about family relationships. That was the gift I'd really given her. Not just money, but autonomy. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in how I saw my own life. For years, I'd measured my worth through other people's treatment of me. If my family included me, I felt valuable. If they excluded me, I felt worthless. Now, I understood that my worth was inherent, not dependent on external validation. I was valuable because I chose to be generous, kind, and loving, not because other people recognized those qualities in me. The house was quiet as I turned off the lights. But it wasn't the desperate quiet of loneliness I'd lived with for so long. It was the peaceful quiet of contentment. Tomorrow, I'd have lunch with Yvonne's daughter, who was visiting from California and had asked specifically to meet me. Tomorrow evening, I'd attend a concert with my book club friends. This weekend, I'd help Laverne prepare for her granddaughter's first cooking lesson. My life was full in ways I'd never imagined when I was fighting so hard to maintain my place in a family that didn't want me there. I'd lost my son and daughter-in-law, maybe permanently, but I'd found myself. And in 18 years, when Emma opened that trust fund and read my letter, she'd learn about a great-grandmother who'd loved her enough to choose dignity over desperation, who'd built a legacy based on principles instead of placating, and who'd discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve. That knowledge would be waiting for her, along with the financial security, to make her own choices about what kind of family relationships she wanted to build. It was the best gift I could give her. The gift of knowing that love doesn't require you to make yourself small, and that true family isn't about blood relations. It's about people who choose to value each other genuinely. I'd finally learned that lesson myself, and I'd never been more at peace. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.